In early 1939, at Factory Number 183 in Kharkiv, Ukraine, chief designer Mikhail Koshkin stood before a committee of Soviet military officers, presenting his proposal for a new medium tank. The design incorporated radical features: sloped armor that would deflect rather than stop shells, a powerful diesel engine instead of gasoline, and a long-barreled 76.2-inch gun. The military committee, dominated by conservative marshals who preferred the proven designs of multi-turreted heavy tanks, dismissed Koshkin's proposal as impractical. They demanded he focus instead on the A-20, a wheeled-track hybrid vehicle based on the aging BT series, which could run on wheels on roads and tracks off-road. The wheel-track system, they insisted, provided strategic mobility that justified its mechanical complexity. Koshkin argued that the future of tank warfare required thick sloped armor, reliable engines, and powerful guns, not the ability to drive on roads with wheels. The committee overruled him. "Build the A-20, they ordered. Koshkin agreed publicly, while privately plotting to prove them catastrophically wrong. Mikhail Ilyich Koshkin was born on December 3, 1898, in Brinchagi, a small village in Yaroslavl Oblast, central Russia. His father died when Mikhail was young, leaving the family impoverished. At age 11, Mikhail was apprenticed to a confectioner in the town of Rybinsk, learning to make candy and pastries. He worked in confectionery through his teenage years, showing no indication of future engineering genius. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and subsequent civil war disrupted his life. In 1918, at age 20, Koshkin joined the Red Army, fighting in the Russian Civil War and then the Polish-Soviet War. He served in an armored train unit, experiencing mechanized warfare firsthand and developing fascination with military technology. After demobilization in 1921, he returned to confectionery work, but the experience of war had changed him. He enrolled in evening classes, studying mathematics and technical drawing. In 1924, at age 26, Koshkin was admitted to the Communist University in Moscow, where he studied political economy and engineering. His talent for technical work became evident, and in 1929 he was sent to the Leningrad Polytechnic Institute for Advanced Engineering Training. He excelled in mechanical design, graduating in 1934 with a focus on automotive and tracked vehicle engineering. At age 36, Koshkin finally embarked on the career that would define his legacy. He joined the design bureau at the Kirov factory in Leningrad, working on heavy tank projects. In 1936, he was transferred to Factory Number 183 in Kharkiv, one of the Soviet Union's premier tank production facilities, and appointed deputy chief designer. When chief designer Afanasy Fursov was arrested during Stalin's purges in 1937, Koshkin was promoted to lead the design bureau, inheriting responsibility for developing the next generation of Soviet tanks. The assignment was urgent and politically dangerous. Soviet tanks had performed poorly during the Spanish Civil War, where BT series fast tanks proved vulnerable to anti-tank guns and prone to catching fire due to gasoline engines. The Red Army demanded a replacement, but senior officers disagreed on what that replacement should be. Some advocated for multi-turreted heavy tanks like the T-35, massive machines weighing over 45 tons, armed with 5 turrets, and carrying 11 crew members. These behemoths looked impressive in parades, but were mechanically unreliable, slow, and difficult to command in battle. Others preferred light, fast tanks like the BT series, which could exploit breakthroughs but lacked armor and firepower. Koshkin studied both approaches and concluded they were wrong. The future belonged to medium tanks combining mobility, protection, and firepower in a single design. He began sketching what would become the T-34. Koshkin's revolutionary insight was sloped armor. Traditional tanks used vertical armor plates, relying on thickness to stop shells. Koshkin proposed angling armor at 60 degrees from vertical, which increased the effective thickness without adding weight. A 45mm plate angled at 60 degrees provided protection equivalent to 90mm of vertical armor. Sloped armor also caused shells to ricochet rather than penetrate, defeating projectiles that would punch through vertical plates of equal thickness. The concept was not entirely new, but no one had applied it so comprehensively. Koshkin designed the T-34 with sloped armor on the hull front, sides, and turret, creating a streamlined profile that maximized protection while minimizing weight. The design was elegant, efficient, and heretical to conservative tank officers who believed thick vertical armor was the only reliable defense. The diesel engine was equally controversial. Soviet tanks traditionally used gasoline engines, which were lighter and produced more power per liter than diesels. But gasoline was highly flammable, and tank crews feared fire more than enemy shells. A single penetrating hit could turn a gasoline-powered tank into an inferno. Koshkin proposed the V2 diesel engine, a powerful aluminum block design developed by Konstantin Chelpin. Diesel fuel was less volatile than gasoline, reducing fire risk dramatically. The V2 produced 500 horsepower, enough to propel a 30-ton tank at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour. The engine was reliable, fuel-efficient, and revolutionary. Military conservatives argued that diesel engines were heavier, more expensive, and harder to maintain than gasoline engines. Koshkin responded with data showing that diesel's lower fire risk and better fuel economy more than compensated for any disadvantages. When Koshkin presented his design in 1939, the military committee rejected it and ordered him to focus on the A-20 wheeled track hybrid. The A-20 retained the BT series ability to run on wheels or tracks, a feature military planners considered essential for strategic mobility. Koshkin believed the wheel track system was a pointless complication that added weight and mechanical complexity without meaningful benefit. Modern tanks would fight in mud, snow, and rough terrain where wheels were useless, but orders were orders. Koshkin instructed his team to build the A-20 prototype, while secretly working on his preferred design. He called it the A-32, ostensibly a variant of the A-20 with heavier armor and no wheels. In reality, the A-32 was the T-34 in all but name. Koshkin worked nights and weekends, using factory resources unofficially, building the tank he believed the Red Army needed rather than the one they demanded. By May 1939, both prototypes were complete. The A-20 had 20mm armor, a short-barreled 45mm gun, and the troublesome wheel track system. The A-32 had 32mm armor, a long-barreled 76.2mm gun, and tracks only. In August 1939, both tanks underwent trials at the Kubinka Proving Ground near Moscow. Military observers expected the A-20 to outperform the A-32, particularly in speed and strategic mobility. Instead, the A-32 proved faster off-road, more reliable, and far better armed. The A-20's wheels were useless in mud and added unnecessary weight. The A-32's sloped armor deflected shells that penetrated the A-20's vertical plates. The A-32's 76.2mm gun destroyed targets the A-20's 45mm gun could barely damage. The trials demonstrated that Koshkin had been right and the military committee wrong. The Soviet-Finnish Winter War of 1939-1940 provided brutal real-world validation. Soviet tanks, including BT series and T-26 light tanks, struggled in deep snow and Finnish forests. Light armor made them vulnerable to anti-tank guns. Gasoline engines froze or caught fire. Crews suffered catastrophic losses. The Red Army desperately needed a tank that could survive harsh conditions, penetrate enemy defenses, and withstand punishment. On December 19, 1939, the Defense Committee approved production of an improved A-32 with 45mm frontal armor and a 76.2 mod L-11 gun. Koshkin named it the T-34, supposedly after the year 1934 when he began formulating ideas for the new tank, though others suggest he chose the name to commemorate a 1934 decree expanding Soviet armored forces. Regardless, the T-34 was approved. But approval was not production. Soviet industry was stretched thin, and factory managers resisted tooling up for a new tank design. Skeptics remained influential, arguing that proven designs should take priority over experimental vehicles. Koshkin understood that only a dramatic demonstration would silence opposition. In early 1940, he proposed driving two T-34 prototypes from Kharkiv to Moscow, a distance of over 750 kilometers, to present them directly to Soviet leadership. The journey would serve as a brutal endurance test, demonstrating reliability under operational conditions. Critics scoffed, predicting the tanks would break down within 100 kilometers. Koshkin's team completed two pre-production T-34s in January 1940 and prepared for the legendary test drive. On March 5, 1940, two T-34 prototypes departed factory number 183 in Kharkiv. Commanded by Koshkin and driven by factory test drivers, the route deliberately avoided roads, traveling cross-country through mud, snow, and forest to test off-road performance. The journey was grueling. Winter conditions were harsh with temperatures well below freezing. The tanks broke through ice on frozen rivers, climbed steep hills, and traversed terrain that would have defeated wheeled vehicles. Koshkin rode in the lead tank, enduring freezing temperatures, diesel fumes, and constant jolting. He was already sick, having caught a cold during earlier tests, but refused to abandon the demonstration. The tanks covered 750 kilometers in 12 days, arriving at the Kremlin on March 17, 1940. The demonstration in Moscow was meticulously staged. The two T-34s drove through Red Square, their sloped armor and powerful profiles impressing spectators. Soviet leaders, including Joseph Stalin, inspected the tanks personally. Koshkin explained the design features: sloped armor providing superior protection, diesel engines reducing fire risk, 76.2mm guns capable of defeating any tank then in service. Stalin walked around the vehicles, peered into hatches, and asked technical questions. Finally, he turned to Koshkin and said, "These tanks are the first swallows of our armored forces. It was approval, endorsement, and vindication. The T-34 would enter mass production. But the demonstration didn't end in Moscow. Koshkin insisted on extending the test drive, taking the tanks to the Mannerheim Line in Finland, where Soviet forces were still engaged in the Winter War, then returning to Kharkiv via Minsk and Kiev. The total journey exceeded 2,000 kilometers, conducted mostly off-road through the worst terrain imaginable. The T-34s performed flawlessly, proving their mechanical reliability and operational capability, but the extended journey in freezing conditions destroyed Koshkin's health. The cold he had caught earlier worsened into pneumonia. By the time the tanks returned to Kharkiv in late April, Koshkin was gravely ill. He refused medical treatment, insisting on continuing work refining the T-34 design based on lessons from the test drive. Throughout the spring and summer of 1940, Koshkin directed final modifications to the T-34 from his sickbed. Pneumonia ravaged his lungs. Doctors urged rest and treatment, but Koshkin refused, working from home when he could no longer walk to the factory. He reviewed blueprints, answered technical questions, and insisted on approving every change. By August, his condition had deteriorated catastrophically. Doctors removed one lung in a desperate attempt to save him, but the infection had spread. On September 26, 1940, at age 41, Mikhail Koshkin died. He never saw the T-34 enter mass production, never witnessed it in combat, and never knew that his tank would become the most produced and arguably most effective tank of World War II. Alexander Morozov, Koshkin's deputy and close collaborator, succeeded him as chief designer and continued refining the T-34. Production began in September 1940 at factory number 183 and other facilities. By June 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army had approximately 967 T-34s in service, concentrated in mechanized corps along the western border. German intelligence was aware that the Soviets had new tanks, but they underestimated their capabilities. Wehrmacht commanders expected to face upgraded versions of the light BT and T-26 tanks they had studied, not a revolutionary medium tank that would dominate the battlefield. The encounter shocked them. On June 22, 1941, German forces invaded the Soviet Union with over 3,000 tanks, primarily Panzer IIIs and IVs. The Panzer III, Germany's main battle tank, carried a 50mm gun and had 30mm of frontal armor. The Panzer IV had a short-barreled 75mm gun and similar armor. German tank crews were confident, having defeated French and British tanks with ease in 1940. When they first encountered T-34s, that confidence evaporated. German 37mm were anti-tank guns, effective against BT and T-26 tanks, bounced off T-34 armor harmlessly. Even 50mm guns could not penetrate the T-34's sloped frontal armor at normal combat ranges. Meanwhile, the T-34's 76.2mm gun destroyed German tanks at ranges exceeding a kilometer. General Heinz Guderian, Germany's leading tank commander, described the first encounter with T-34s as a psychological shock. German tankers found themselves outgunned, out-armored, and outmaneuvered. The T-34's sloped armor caused German shells to ricochet spectacularly. In one documented incident, a single T-34 was hit over 30 times by a battalion-strength contingent of German 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns. None penetrated. The tank withdrew to Soviet lines hours later, battered but operational. German anti-tank gunners began calling their 37mm PAK-36 guns Panzer and Klopfgerät, tank door knockers, because they revealed their positions without damaging T-34s. Germans resorted to deploying 80mm anti-aircraft guns and direct-fire anti-tank rolls, one of the few weapons capable of penetrating T-34 armor reliably. General Ewald von Kleist called the T-34 the finest tank in the world. German field reports emphasized its superiority in every category: armor, firepower, mobility, and reliability. The diesel engine, dismissed by Soviet conservatives, proved its worth in combat. T-34s continued operating in conditions that immobilized German tanks. Wide-track distributed weight, allowing T-34s to traverse mud and snow that German narrow-track tanks sank into helplessly. The V2 diesel, designed for harsh conditions, started reliably in sub-zero temperatures when German gasoline engines froze. The 76 2mm gun outranged and outpenetrated any German tank gun then in service. German tankers learned to fear the T-34, knowing that engagements favored the Soviet tank at all ranges. The T-34's impact on German strategy was profound. Hitler personally ordered development of new tanks capable of countering the T-34, leading to the Panther and Tiger programs. The Panther, introduced in 1943, borrowed the T-34's sloped armor concept directly. German engineers studied captured T-34s, analyzed their design, and incorporated lessons into new vehicles. But producing tanks to match the T-34 required time Germany didn't have. By 1943, Soviet factories were producing thousands of T-34s monthly, overwhelming German forces with numerical superiority backed by qualitative excellence. Over 84,000 T-34s were built during the war, more than any other tank in history. The factories Koshkin had designed the T-34 for mass production achieved production rates that made the tank ubiquitous on the Eastern Front. The T-34 was not perfect. Early models suffered from poor crew ergonomics, inadequate vision devices, and two-man turrets that overworked commanders, who had to command, load, and aim simultaneously. German tankers noted that T-34s often fought poorly, clumping together instead of maneuvering independently and reacting slowly to threats. Soviet tank commanders lacked radios, forcing them to communicate with flags and hand signals. Training was rushed, sending crews into combat with minimal preparation. These tactical and organizational failures cost lives in battles. But the T-34's fundamental design remained sound. As Soviet training improved, tactics evolved, and the T-34-85 variant with an 85mm gun and three-man turret entered service in 1944. The tank's effectiveness multiplied. The T-34-85, designed by Morozov following Koshkin's principles, corrected many earlier deficiencies. The larger turret accommodated a three-man crew, allowing the commander to focus on battlefield awareness while the gunner aimed and the loader handled ammunition. The 84mm ZIS S-53 gun could penetrate German heavy tanks at ranges exceeding 500 meters. Improved vision devices and radios enhanced situational awareness and coordination. The T-34-85 became the definitive Soviet medium tank, serving in Korea, Vietnam, and numerous Cold War conflicts. Some remained in service into the 21st century, a testament to Koshkin's design longevity. Koshkin's legacy is measured not in awards or recognition. Though he received the Stalin Prize posthumously in 1942 and Hero of Socialist Labor in 1990, but in the millions of soldiers whose lives his tank saved and the battles his design won. The T-34 allowed the Soviet Union to survive 1941's catastrophic defeats, rebuild its armies, and eventually drive German forces back across Eastern Europe to Berlin. Without the T-34, Soviet resistance might have collapsed, and World War II's outcome could have been vastly different. The tank a conservative military establishment tried to suppress became the weapon that ensured Soviet survival and victory. The pattern repeats throughout history. Watt's radar was dismissed until it saved Britain. Mitchell's Spitfire was mocked until it defended the skies. Brunel's ships were called extravagant until they connected continents. Harrison's chronometer was rejected until it solved the navigation. Ericsson's monitor was called a cheese box until it changed naval warfare. And Koshkin's T-34 was opposed by Marshals who preferred multi-turreted monsters until it became the most effective tank of World War II. Each innovator faced institutional resistance from authorities invested in existing paradigms. Each persisted despite opposition, and each was vindicated when reality overwhelmed prejudice. Koshkin's 2,000-kilometer test drive became legendary in Soviet military history, celebrated as an example of determination and vision. The man who drove his tanks through snow and mud while dying of pneumonia embodied the sacrifice demanded by war. His willingness to risk his life, quite literally, to prove his design's worth demonstrated that innovation requires not just intelligence, but courage. The conservative marshals who dismissed sloped armor and diesel engines were proven catastrophically wrong by combat results. Koshkin's genius lay not in inventing new technologies, but in synthesizing existing concepts into an optimal design, and then fighting bureaucracy as fiercely as his tank fought the Wehrmacht. The T-34 transformed Soviet tank doctrine. Before Koshkin, Soviet tanks were divided into light reconnaissance vehicles, fast cavalry tanks, and slow, heavy breakthrough tanks. Koshkin's medium tank combined roles, providing speed, protection, and firepower in a single platform. Soviet doctrine evolved to emphasize mass employment of medium tanks, overwhelming enemies through quantity and quality simultaneously. German defenses, designed to stop infantry and light tanks, collapsed under T-34 assaults. By 1943, Soviet tank armies, each containing hundreds of T-34s, could break through fortified lines and exploit deep into German rear areas. The very operational art Soviet theorists had envisioned but lacked the equipment to execute until Koshkin's tank arrived. In Kharkiv, a monument stands to Mikhail Koshkin and his legendary tank, a bronze T-34 on a pedestal with Koshkin's statue nearby. The inscription honors him as creator of the tank that helped win the Great Patriotic War. Tourists photograph the monument, most unaware of the story behind it. The confectioner who became an engineer, the designer who defied conservative marshals, the sick man who drove 2,000 kilometers to prove his tank worked, and the visionary who died months before his creation vindicated his every decision. The T-34 outlived its creator by decades, serving in armies worldwide, but every tank carried Koshkin's fingerprints. Sloped armor, diesel engine, powerful gun, and design optimized for mass production. Koshkin never sought fame. He wanted to build the best possible tank, knowing war was coming and that Soviet soldiers would depend on his design for survival. He fought bureaucracy, defied orders subtly, worked himself to death, and died before witnessing his vindication. The T-34 he created saved millions of Soviet soldiers, destroyed thousands of German tanks, and helped win World War II. The Marshals, who demanded multi-turreted monsters and wheeled-track hybrids, were forgotten. Koshkin's tank defined armored warfare for a generation and influenced every tank design that followed. The cheese box the conservatives rejected became the weapon that saved the Soviet Union.